for ADEvantage Technology. Welcome to our FormADE tutorial. FormADE is one of the technologies invented by ADEvantage Technology. It empowers our customers to create their own forms, photo requirements, and question logic, and is used in both InspectorADE and PreservADE. Using InspectorADE as an example, let me show you how FormADE works. To get to FormADE, log into your administrator account and click on the FormADE tab. If you don't see this tab available to you and you believe you are using an administrator account, contact support to have them enable it for you by emailing support@adevantagetech.com. Let's begin by clicking on the FormADE tab. Here you see where all of our FormADE forms are listed. As this is our first form, there are none yet listed. To begin a new form, click on the New Form button on the top right. This is the Form Designer interface for FormADE. It is divided into 4 sections: the form name, the form container, the element toolbox and property area, and the Repeatable Templates section. We will discuss each of these in more detail, starting with the form name. Form names can be whatever you like, although we have some formatting recommendations to make finding forms in a list of forms you've created easier in the future. First, you begin with the client name and some kind of delineator, like a semicolon or a colon or a dash. And then a form description, or the work code itself. We'll make this one an exterior inspection. Finally, there's the client identifier. Now this may be the way that the form is identified on your client side. Some forms may have an ID number or some kind of a formatting code. We'll put an ID number in for this one. The next section that we can discuss is the Form Builder section itself. This is easier to discuss when we put it in combination with the Properties and the Elements section over here on the right. Essentially, each of these blue boxes over here is a drag and drop control that you can put into the area over here to build the form. So let's begin with a date input, since most forms actually use date inputs quite a bit. We'll just go ahead and take that date input and drop it over into this area. The green highlight means that this particular input is currently selected, and so when we go to the Properties tab, we'll be seeing the properties of that particular input. There are a number of fields here, and I'll go over them so that we understand what each one is for. First is the type field. Now, the type field is actually the type of the control, the element that is over there on the form itself, and you can select by choosing which one you want it to be in this drop down. You can just change it. So if I wanted it to be a text label, or if I wanted it to be a text input, I can do that just by changing this drop down. The key here is very important. So the key is when we send orders back over JSON or over our web services to clients, the key is the name of the key value pair that this particular question will have. So if you're sending this back via web services, then you want this key to be something that you'll recognize on the client side, on the receiving side of the form data. If you're not, then you can have the key, it just needs to be unique to the form. It can be whatever you want. So I'll go ahead and name our key here, or how about completed date. Label here is the actual label that is shown to the contractor or inspector filling out the form when they get it on the mobile device or on the web. So we're going to go ahead and start typing in here, and you'll see that as I type, it actually changes on the left-hand side. We'll call it date completed just so it's different than the key. We can tell them apart. There's a number of parameters around this particular field too. There's the current date, which is the default value. You can also make the default value a specific date, and it will give you a calendar where you can do so. We're going to go ahead and make the default value the current date. That way, when an inspector or contractor opens up a blank form, this field is already filled in with today's date. You can also make minimum and maximum requirements on this field so that they can't predate the form. It has to be the form control can have a date that's no earlier than today's date, or no earlier than some other specific date you choose. And you can have a maximum on there as well, same parameters. And finally, there's this validation error message. So if the validation parameters for a given element are not met, then you can then this validation error message is displayed. If you don't put anything here, we'll still highlight the field in yellow if it's not filled in. But if you want specific validation parameters, it's easier if you explain to the form user what parameters or what validation parameters you're expecting for this particular input. So in this case, date. So if I want that to be, whoops, let me quality tree here. If I want that to be, date must be today's date or later, I just go ahead and make my minimum the current date, and now my validation message matches whatever my parameters are here. Down here we have the checkboxes. We have required. We recommend that all of the form elements be required, and that if a form element is not required, that we use conditions, which we'll talk about here shortly, to hide form elements that are not required. That way, the rules are pretty simple for filling out a form in the field. If the field is visible, it needs to be filled in. We have this option here to pre-populate certain fields from previous form data. This can be turned on a field-by-field basis. Essentially what this does is takes the data that was populated in that field from last month's inspection, if last month's inspection was done on this system, and then pre-fills the field with that information on this new month's blank form. That's useful for things that don't change very often, perhaps the color of the house or the number of floors of a house. And is certainly you don't want it turned on something like the occupancy or the height of the grass. And so there are places where this makes sense, and places where it doesn't, you get to choose as the builder of the form. Finally, we have this hide when printing form option down here, and this is literally whether or not you want to hide this particular field when somebody prints this form to a piece of paper. Okay, let's explore some of the other elements that are available here in the New Elements tab. We have our date. Let's go ahead and add ourselves a text input here. And we'll look at some of the properties that we can do with text inputs. You can see that the text input is highlighted green. So when we go to the Properties tab, that's the input whose properties we'll see. It's type text input. Here again we have the key. I'm just going to go ahead and put that, for our purposes, we're going to call that the Realtor phone. We're just kind of building a fake form here. For the label here, we'll call it Realtor phone. And then down here is the default value. Default value will be the value that this particular field has if the contractor or the inspector does not change it. That differs from the placeholder value, which is a value that is displayed in that field and is not saved if the contractor or inspector does not change it. It's simply, I guess you could think of it as ghost text that is there for the purposes of explaining or showing to the form user what you're expecting to be filled in that field. So for phone numbers, this is really convenient. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a fake phone number here. And so you get an idea here of the format, and the text is grayed out. I'll show you how this works when we go to preview the form. For text fields, we actually have the ability for you to use regular expressions in order to validate the text that has been put into text fields. Regular expressions, we have a few that are canned here, for instance an email or a 10-digit phone number from 1 to 30 characters, and you can change that number. So we're going to go ahead and take the pre-canned one for a 10-digit phone number for this particular case. However, if you want to learn more about regular expressions or write and test your own, you can click on this Learn More button, and it will open up a web page where you get a small tutorial on how to use regular expressions and a sandbox that you can play in order to test your regular expressions. There are a lot of places that you can go, like regularexpressions.com, to get more information about these. Alright, so we'll go ahead and take a 10-digit phone number regular expression. And since we're requiring a specific format, our validation error message will be phone number must be in the format of. Okay. Fix my typos. And there we go. Again, we have the same 3 checkboxes that we had down below, so I won't explain those again. Alright, let's do another element. Let's see, let's go ahead and do a radio input element. Go ahead and drop this over here. Radio input elements are different than dates or text elements in that we have to provide the list of options that the user is going to choose from when they come to this element. So we have the same types of things. We have the type, we have the key. I'm going to call this our condition tester. And label here is going to be choose an option. So we have some preset lists of options that you may choose for this, yes, no, or yes, no, and A. I'm not going to use either of those. I'm going to go ahead and add an option manually. And I'm going to call this label, we're going to call it A. I'll add another option, C, and add another option, B. By using the arrows here, you can rearrange the order of the options without deleting them and retyping them. Of course, you can also delete them if you want to. The label is what appears to the user or what the actual radio button is labeled with. The value is what is saved in the key condition tester when that particular label is chosen. So we could have this be 1 and this be 2 and this be 3, and that way when I chose this A button, then the value 1 would be stored in the key condition tester. If you don't really want the value to differ from the label itself, there's a shortcut. And you can use this checkbox here, use labels for values. If I check that, then you can see that the value option goes away for each label, and it only asks me for the label. The reason for that is that the value is essentially the same as the label when that box is checked. We also have the default down here where you can choose a default value, and usually we leave that blank. Display columns allows us to choose how many columns of radio buttons will be shown. You can have a number from 1 to 3. A single column of radio buttons means that they'll all be put in vertically like this. However, to save space and to make the form more readable, sometimes it makes sense to have either 2 columns or 3 columns of radio buttons. Since I have 3 radio buttons and their labels for those radio buttons are relatively short, I'm going to go ahead and put in 3 columns as display columns. So we'll get A, B, and C when this is finally rendered in the preview form, which we'll look at in just a moment. Alert Previous is an option that I can choose if the option that I have chosen this month differs than the option that I chose last month. It will alert that there was a previous response and what the response was before and ask if I really mean to make a change. I'm going to leave that blank this time. Validation error message, again, you can put in a custom error message if you want to, but since we're simply selecting an individual radio button, then I don't really need to have an error message. I just need one of those selected. Highlight Previous, again, is a way to show with a highlight that highlights the background of one of these options as the one that was chosen last month, as opposed to actually selecting it, which is what the prepopulate will do. So you kind of have different between Alert Previous, Highlight Previous, and Prepopulate. You have different ways of indicating to the form user what happened last month or what's happened on this form in the past. The radio input is very similar to 2 other inputs in our list here. The drop-down input or the select input and the checkbox input are essentially the same kinds of properties that you would have here, and you would arrange them the same way as we have for our radio input. Let's go back to our elements toolbox here, and we'll find another element that we haven't explored yet. Let's take a look at the numeric input and look at the properties for it. So for our numeric input, again, we have our very familiar by now key and label pair. So I'll go ahead and call this num floors, and our label here will be number of floors. Default value, I'm going to leave blank. The minimum is going to be 0 floors, and the maximum, I'll just arbitrarily choose 4 as the maximum number of floors. And over here, our validation error message is going to be the number of floors must be between 0 and 4. All right. We have the same 3 checkbox buttons down here as we have had on our other, at the bottom of our other elements. I think we've kind of had a chance to take a look at this a bit, so let's take a look at as far as the inputs section. So let's take a look at our preview form. I'll go ahead and click on that. And you can see that we have a number of different elements on the form here. We have our date completed, and with that we get our calendar input with our next month, last month, current date, editing individual components of it, just with a quick drag and drop. The realtor phone number has that ghost text in it, or the placeholder text, and as soon as we start typing in that field, you can see that that placeholder text disappears. I'll go ahead and leave it blank for the moment. We can choose an option. We have 1, 2, 3 columns for our 3 radio buttons here, so we can choose the different radio buttons for values. And on the numeric for number of floors, we can go ahead and put in a number. It does not let us put in any kind of text, and we can increase and decrease that number with the controls over here on the right. I can test this form by pushing validate. And validate will tell me where I have either not filled in a value, or where I have, and show me the custom error message that's associated with it, or where I have put in something that is outside of the parameters that are required. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in a phone number here just so I can show that it does indeed validate. And then number of floors will decrease down to a reasonable number. We'll go ahead and validate that. We see that all of the yellow text went away. Another element button here that we can look at is the export button. Now if you're using the web services that come with our system, or you're looking to get the JSON or XML data representation of the form that you're creating, this export button will be helpful. You can see that here in this JSON representation of the actual form as it's been filled out above. You can see that we have the completed date, which is the key that we defined for date completed at the top, and the value of that particular element in ISO format. Here we can see realtor phone and the phone number. Again, condition tester, we've chosen B, and number of floors 4. Go ahead and close our form preview here. And let's take a look at some of the elements here in the design section. Obviously, section is the first element in the design section. Sections essentially work as ways to group together parts of your form. And this helps it to look better and helps it to flow better on the actual display on the mobile device and on the website. Sections essentially flow your information either vertically or horizontally. I just drag a section out onto the form here. It's an empty section, as you can see, and we're now looking at the properties of that section. You can see that these 3 dots here are oriented vertically, and that this particular section has a vertical orientation. If I change that to a horizontal orientation so that things would flow horizontally, then the dots are also horizontal. Pretty straightforward. The label here allows us to give a name to this section. And that is sometimes desired when you're actually grouping together different questions into individual groups. So let me show you our preferred way for dealing with sections. Usually we have an overarching horizontal section that contains the entire form and all of the elements. To that horizontal section, we will add usually between 3 and 4 vertical sections. Those vertical sections are essentially the columns in the form. So now I've got the form itself, which is this overarching section, and then 3 separate columns in the form. Now in each column, we will add some number of sections that represent the question groups. So for instance, date completed can be put into this first question group. And I will add another section here for the realtor phone. And finally another section here for the choose your option, and I'll actually drag number of floors in there. So you can have as many elements within each section as you want to. And I can certainly add more sections in here as needed. So this shows another unnamed section, and we'll talk about what that's for here in a moment. So let's look at ways we can name these sections. So I'm going to go to the properties of this section, and this particular question group is how I'm using this section, is actually the date completed. So I can go ahead and give it a date completed title. In doing so, I no longer need the date completed piece, that the date completed label on that particular question, because it's the only question in this section. So we'll go ahead and delete that. And I can do the same thing here for realtor phone. And we'll remove that label. And I can do the same thing here. I'm going to leave the question titles on this one since I have more than 1 question within this section. And I'm just going to go ahead and call this our condition testing. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like when we look at it in the preview form now that we've done our section layout. And you can see that each question now, instead of being spread out across the whole page, has its own containing box and title, and the questions are grouped according to wherever those titles are. This way of doing the forms looks much cleaner to the users and makes it much easier to see how the form flows when you view it on the web page. On the mobile device, all of these columns are going to be stacked. So you'd get the first column, and then you'd get the second column, and then you get the third column as one continuous column. So it doesn't really matter so much on the mobile device, but this does make it look much nicer on the website. Let's go back to the New Elements tab here and talk about the other two elements here in the Design section. There's the text label, which literally just adds a label of text to your form. So if you wanted to give some instructions, or if you wanted to give something that's simply hard-coded information, then you would just go ahead and type it, and that would simply become a text label that's in your form. We also have a line, which is the same thing as a horizontal line in HTML, so you can use this as a way to break up different parts of your form, or maybe question sections. So if I jump to preview form here real quick, you'll be able to see the horizontal line and the hard-coded text that's there. Let's take a look at some of the options that are up here in the Settings menu. Here in Settings, we can choose 3 different items. We can choose showing the help popovers, which will turn off the help that appears when we hover over the various labels here. You can turn that off if you like. We can disable the Inspector Comments field. This is only applicable for InspectorADE. In InspectorADE, all inspections have a comments field, a general comments field, appended to the bottom of their forms. If you don't want that to be appended to your form, then you can disable that by clicking on this checkbox here. Finally, we have the photo label set. Again, in InspectorADE, photo labels are done on a per-client basis. So here you would choose the photo label set that you want to use for your particular client. Once you've chosen your photo label set, you would hit Update, and those labels would be applied to your form. In PreservADE, you would also have this photo label set, but the photo labels are not specific to the client. In PreservADE, you would be able to choose the photo group that you wanted to be associated with your form. Let's take a look at the last tab we have not looked at yet, the Conditions tab. When I open the Conditions tab, I can see that there are a couple of different sections. There's the Conditions section, where I will create conditions and related actions that I can use to manipulate parts of the form. There's the Flag Conditions area, where I can define conditions where certain flags will be set on the form. For instance, I can declare what on my form means for this location to be occupied, or to be vacant, or to be damaged, or to be out of area, whatever flags that I want to be able to set for that form. And I use the same conditions language that I would use for declaring the conditions up above. And down below here I have repeatable template conditions, and with repeatable template conditions, those are conditions that I can apply to repeatable templates, which we will talk about last. Let's go create one of the conditions up above. I will click on Add New Rule to add a new condition to the form. I can change the name of the condition by clicking on the pencil next to the condition and typing in the new condition's name. Now I have a target input button here that allows me to determine which question is going to be the source for the condition that I'm going to create. I click on the target to arm it, and it turns blue. Now the next item that I click on, the next element I click on, will be the element that is determining the source of the data for this condition. So I'm going to click on Choose an Option here, and I can see that the field Condition Tester, which is what I called the key for this particular question, is now been filled in for me. You can also see, as an aside, if I drop this down, that there are various other sections and pieces of data that are available here built into the form background. So if you find that you're unable to do something, let us know, and we'll be able to show you where that information is located. Here in the condition tester, though, we're just going to say that if the condition tester value is equal to A, which is the value of this particular radio button, that I'm going to come down here and I'm going to apply invisibility to a particular target. My target is going to be number of floors. So I'm going to click on the target item here and arm it. It turns blue, just like I did with the target input. And I'm going to click on number of floors. And you can see that the ID number of that target has shown up here. It does become difficult sometimes to identify which is the input and which is the target. So if you click on Identify Input, the input is scrolled to the top of the screen and flashes for you, and identifying a target does the same thing. Makes it easy to find where your condition and where your actions are taking place for a given condition that you've built into the form. Let's go ahead and preview our form and see how that condition works. We click on Preview Form, go over here, and I choose option A, and sure enough the number of floors question goes away. I choose option B, and it comes back. That's just what we told our condition to do. What I actually wanted, however, was for number of floors to appear when I chose option A. To do that, I want to do the opposite of apply invisible, and that is to apply inverse invisible. Let's go ahead and see how that looks. Now the number of floors control is gone when the form first loads. When I choose option A, the number of floors input appears, and only when I choose option A. Some of the comparison operators that are available in the conditions section are things like equals, does not equal, starts with, does not contain. So this is pretty flexible as far as what kinds of comparisons you want to make between the data that is in the question that you're interested in and the value that is there. For radio buttons, you would use equals and does not equal, and for checkboxes, you would use contains and does not contain. We can also combine multiple conditions so that when either one or both of those is true, we can take certain actions. To do so, we come down to the options down here for AND and OR. Let's choose the OR condition. Now I have two conditions where if either one is true, the action will take place. For the first condition, I'm going to target the condition tester, and I'm going to say if that is equal to A. For the second condition, I'm also going to target condition tester and say that is equal to B. So now, if condition tester is equal to A, or condition tester is equal to B, then we'll take this action. Let's take a look at that in the preview form. I can see that the num floors is invisible, and when I select A, it becomes visible. When I select something that's not A or B, it's invisible, and now when I select B, it's visible. So literally when A or B is selected, it's visible. Okay, let's put this back to equals and take a look at some of the things we can do with actions now. I'm going to go ahead and we have this show num floors. I'm going to create a new rule. I'm going to collapse this rule, and I'm going to add a new rule. This rule we're going to call photo condition. And for this rule, I'm going to say that if condition tester is equal to B, then I'm going to require a photo label. That photo label can be selected from the list, and if you remember, this list of photo labels comes from the list that we set up here in settings. So let's just check outbuilding as an example, and for this particular photo label I can choose a minimum and a maximum of photos, or neither if I wish, and it will assume one is a minimum and an unlimited maximum for this particular label. When this condition is true, that will require between 1 and 4 outbuilding photos, or photos that are labeled with the outbuilding label. I can add as many actions as I want to this particular condition. So for instance, I could require additional photo labels as additional actions. And I'm just picking random ones here. Since we can require photo labels as certain conditions of the form, we can actually calculate within the form and on the mobile device and on the web which labels are needed and when. We can display this very easily. Usually what we do is we come down, we create another section. I'm going to call this my required photos section, although you can name it whatever you want. And we simply drag the list photo requirements element from the advanced section into required photos. That's it. Let's go and see how this works. If I go into Preview Form, I know that if I choose element A, that I get number of floors. If I choose element B, now I have some required photos. The outbuilding requires between 1 and 4 photos. The auto photo requires between 1 and 3 photos. If I were to export this, I can also see that under the required photos section, those label IDs and those particular quantities are also expressed. So one of the things that we can do with conditions as well is to require photos under all conditions. Let me show you how to do this. I'm going to add a new rule, and I'm going to call this always required photos. And in here, I'm basically going to come to new elements. I'm going to take a hidden input and just drag it someplace on my form, top of here. It's a hidden input, so it's not going to show up to anybody. But I can here, in the key, call this always required photos and set a value of y for default. Now, because this is hidden, the only way to change this is with other conditions. But what we're going to do here instead is I'm going to use that as my condition. So we're going to go ahead and target that input, and I'm going to say if that value is equal to y, then I'm going to require certain photos. And so let's pick front of house, and we want at least 2 photos and a maximum of 6 photos for the front of house. Alright, so now if I go here and I preview my form, then I can see that no matter what I do, or no matter what I choose, the front of house photos are required. And if I then add other photos through requirements that the form expresses, then those are simply added to my existing photo requirements. We have some manipulation buttons up here for dealing with conditions, especially when we get a fair number of them associated with a form. For instance, we can collapse all conditions so that they're all just names and they're easy to parse through to figure out which one you want to work with, and you can open them with these arrows on the right. You can show all conditions, which just opens them all. We also have some ways that you can use to detect which conditions and which actions are operating on certain questions. For instance, if I choose and select this particular question, then I can ask, show me the conditions where this particular question is selected in the condition. So I can see that condition tester here on show num floors is in the condition, as it is in photo condition, and not in the always required photos because that's based on the hidden input. If I collapse all, then I can come down here to number of floors and say, show me the actions that act on this particular item. And I can see that show num floors is expanded because that's the only condition that actually acts on that particular element. The other two act on photo requirements. Okay, we're going to go ahead and collapse all of these. Flag conditions work very similarly, and I'm not going to actually do an example of this in the interest of time, but if you go ahead and click on Configure Flag, you see that you get the exact same kind of condition interface that you get for the conditions that result in actions. And all you would need to do is to go ahead and select a given condition and give it a given value, and if this condition evaluates to true, you get all the same options down here as you did up above, then the flag would be set for this particular inspection. So in this case, we would say that you did gain interior access, or the inspector did gain interior access on this form if this condition was true. I'm going to go ahead and remove that configuration. The last topic we'll cover here in our FormADE tutorial is about repeatable templates. Repeatable templates are templates that you can repeat based on some answer that exists elsewhere in the form, usually a numeric. Repeatable templates are used when you have a multi-story apartment building or a multi-tenant unit or various other repeatable form elements that need to be created based on a certain question that's been answered in the form. So let's go ahead and add a new template down here. We're going to call this floor description. Now, templates are created the same way that you create forms. You can think of them like subforms. So we're going to go over here to our new elements, and for my repeatable template, I'm going to put it inside of a section so that it has its own header name. I'm going to call this floor. Now in repeatable templates, you're going to get a numeric value for each version of the form, 1 through whatever your template name is. And the way to access that value is with this construct. And what this essentially says is the chevrons here to the left and right are escaping out into our programming system underlying the form, and we're able to save the number here inside of a repeatable template means the number of the template ID, and then the value is going to put that into human readable text, in this case an actual digit. So we're going to say floor, then the number of the floor information. And then we're going to drag, well, let's just put a couple of easy things in there. We're going to put in a text input and then a text area input. And that's probably good enough just for our testing purposes here. So for our text input, I'm going to put in floor condition, and I'm going to put in floor condition for label, and down here I'm going to type in the floor description. And again, I get all the same ability to do validation regular expressions inside of repeatable templates as I do in my regular form for all of my form elements. Okay, so let's add our repeatable template to our form. What we do is we take this repeated content element here, and I'm going to put it up underneath this. Actually, I'm going to replace the text element. We don't need that anymore. And we'll go up here to the Properties tab with repeated content selected. And we can see that we have a key here that represents the container that will contain all of the iterations of the repeatable content templates. So the container here I'm going to call floor information. The template we get to choose from a list because we may have more than one repeatable template down here. Of course, we only have one, so we'll choose that from our list. And then the source key. The source key we select using the target input. I'm going to arm that and go ahead and select a number of floors. And the print default is going to be 1. Print default is if somebody were to print this out on a piece of paper, then they would get at least one repeatable template section printed out in the repeated content area so that they would know what questions were required for each repeated section. You can also hide this completely when printing form. Alright, well, let's take a look and see how that looks. I'm going to go ahead and click Preview Form up here. And I can see that I have my required photos. If I choose option A, I get number of floors. If I choose, say, I have 3 floors, then I will get floor 1 information with its content and description, floor 2, floor 3. And each has its own little container because we put it inside of a section, and we get this various questionnaires repeated for each of the floors. If I click on Export, then I can see that inside of floor information, which is that container that I mentioned for the repeated content, I have the first iteration of that repeated section, the second iteration of that repeated section, and then the third. I hope that you've enjoyed our tutorial here on FormADE and plan to take advantage of it in InspectorADE and PreservADE. If you have any questions, you can of course reach us at sales@ADEvantageTechnology.com or here at our phone number 503-365-2727, extension 2 for technical support. You don't need to take advantage of all FormADE features to use FormADE. At its core, it's very simple. But you will improve your in-field data quality and turnaround time if you build your business requirements right into the form and take advantage of FormADE's flexibility. Check out our other tutorial videos on our YouTube channels. Thank you for watching.